Korea's most valuable natural resource, and we're glad to have the students of this community here today. I don't think many Americans can point to such a distinguished record as Ken Gifford Pinchot, whose career was best summed up in his own statement on his 40th anniversary of the Forest Service he had helped to found. "I have been a governor now and then," he said, "but I have been a forester all the time, and shall be to my dying day." He was more than a forester. He was the father of American conservation. He believed that the riches of this continent should be used for all the people to provide a more abundant life. And he believed that the waste of these resources, or the exploitation by a few, was a threat to our national democratic life. His career marked the beginning of a professional approach in preserving our national resources. The fact of the matter is that this institute is needed, and similar institutes across our country, more today than ever before in our history, because we are reaching the limits of our fundamental needs of water to drink, of fresh air to breathe, of open space to enjoy, of abundant sources of energy. But in the field of resources, the opportunities which are lost now can never be won back. I hope that in the years to come, that these years in which we live and now hold responsibility will also be regarded as years of accomplishment in maintaining and expanding the resources of our country, which belong to all of our people, not merely those who are now alive, but all those who are coming later, and what Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and Amos Pinchot and others did in the first 50 years of this century will serve as a stimulus to all of us in the last 50 years to make this country we love more beautiful. Thank you.
It's almost really a gratuitous reference to Amos Pinchot. I mean, you know, who in that audience ever even heard of Amos Pinchot? You know, maybe a few of them. Obviously, the family members that are there. He's just saying that as, I guess, obviously, he's got to show respect to. I think Amos's widow is up there too, along with her two daughters, Mary and Antoinette, Tony. But there's a lot of intrigue there with Mary Pinchot Meyer. She had just been divorced shortly before, but her ex-husband was shortly before she started this affair with JFK. But her ex-husband was a very high-level CIA officer, and there's a great deal of intrigue about what exactly went down with assassination, the murder. You know, you have to believe in a magic bullet. It's the only way to avoid concluding that what actually happened that day has never really been discovered or identified. But anyway. But she died too. She was murdered too, interestingly enough. There's a whole bunch of intrigue about her murder. 10 months, I think, or within a year of JFK's murder, Mary Pinchot Meyer was killed. And she kept a diary, which mysteriously disappeared. But anyway, it's speculated that in that diary she had all kinds of information about, you know, her husband, mainly, and what he was doing. But anyway, enough of that stuff. But that's a fascinating historical document, isn't it? This little speech here. You know, he talks about how we all have one common land, air, and water, and wildlife, and we all share these common resources, and we need to protect them, and the role of the federal government is to protect those resources, right? What an about turn our country has made since those times. And I encountered you know, today's a day to get even more political than perhaps we already have. But I came across the type of governance structure that had the spirit of what Kennedy was talking about here and the spirit of politics as he envisioned it. Maybe I'm being somewhat charitable to the man, but had this spirit of politics endured, and he at, you know, late in his life, I mean, near the end of it, before he was killed, he became a voice for international for peace and for the United Nations, for a greater role for the United Nations in an international governance structure. And if you apply that international governance structure to natural resources, then you could see a very different kind of future that could have unfolded, right? And now, though, we have an entirely different future, which is dominated by what? Again, transnationalism, internationalism, but not of the model that Kennedy and the people who supported Kennedy would have approved of. What we see now is globalization, not through a political human rights and earth rights perhaps based organization like the United Nations, right, which was set up. It's a very progressive international governance structure, the rudiments, right, the basic framework of what, and they've done some good work over this. Right, Eleanor Roosevelt was behind that. But since then, in the last 40, 50 years, we've seen that vision of an international governance structure eclipsed by this corporate globalism, global corporatism model that we see coming especially to full flower with these recent international, they're called trade agreements, right? But they're really not trade agreements at all. Partly, a small part of them are trade. I'm speaking here of things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Alliance, or whatever it's called. And more recently, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which our buddy President Obama, right, the great environmentalist and labor rights advocate and great progressive, has made his signature, appears to be the signature thing that he wants to get through in the last, in his remaining time in office, right? He wants to push through this TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, was another one of these so-called trade agreements. But what's happening is that national sovereignty, not just our national and state and local government sovereignty, but the sovereignty of nations all around the world, especially much more vulnerable nations, impoverished nations in South America, Latin America, and Asia, and Africa are much more vulnerable. And what's happening is these investor-state dispute settlement processes are built into ISDS for short, investor-state dispute. And then the investor is the transnational corporation, and the state, of course, is some government, government of Cuba, the government of Canada, the government of the United States, you name it, right? The government of Chile, etc. And these are provisions in these trade agreements which are extremely favorable to the corporate side of this deal, right? And so basically what's happening with the TPP is, well, let's just read some of this. And the only reason I'm starting this way is because I would like to start with trying to understand what the heck is happening. Let's just throw that out right now. Does anybody have any idea why our society's relationship with natural resources is so dysfunctional? What is going on? Do any of you ever wake up? I imagine some of you do. Young people, and anybody who's alive is young as far as I'm concerned, because you got to deal with reality. You got to take a breath, and you got to eat, all that stuff. So everyone's young, and everyone wakes up at some point and just is amazed, right? I'm amazed sometimes at how far down the rat hole we have gone, or the rabbit hole, right? The rabbit hole into this bizarre world where the mainstream appears to be deranged, completely insane in its goals and how it's going about trying to achieve those goals, right? One can't observe the international scene when it comes to anthropogenic global climate destabilization and what we're trying to do about it without just shaking one's head and thinking, God, these people are so unbelievably corrupt and so unbelievably backwards, and they are so willing to listen to people who happen to have a lot of money, right? And how are we going to make any progress, right, if this is the case? But it seems to be getting worse. And something that perhaps all people should be aware of are these transnational agreements, which are being hammered into place and being adopted, forced through national legislatures all over the world in order to ensure the long-term profitability of the corporations that that are going to benefit from these things. Anyway, let's just get into this a little more. Okay, and this is just a new study, all right? I'm not sure what this study is, where it comes from. It's probably one of these. Todd Tucker, I don't know, but I hope it's a peer-reviewed study. Let's see, this is where they refer to it. New York, yeah, York University's Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto has concluded that the beneficiaries of investor-state dispute settlement agreements have overwhelmingly been companies with more than $1 billion per year in annual revenue, especially extra-large companies with more than $10 billion, and individuals with more than $100 million in net wealth. All right. Report authors Gus Van Harten and Pavel Malashewski point out that the legitimacy of the ISDS concept appears to depend in part on an expectation that it benefits smaller businesses, not just multinationals and the super wealthy, but that does not appear to be the case. Virtually all of the financial benefits of the ISDS have gone to the rich and powerful. Nearly 95% of all award money went to giant corporations or extremely wealthy individuals. And even, obviously the ISDS, the lawyers that make up these arbitration, right? What's happened is these agreements direct disputes between investors and governments to a transnational tribunal. All right, that's what it comes down to. A transnational arbitration panel. And guess who sits on the transnational arbitration panel? The lawyers, the lobbyists who work for the corporations. Do any of our elected legislators get to sit on these international tribunals that through these ISDS agreements have undermined our sovereignty? Right now whenever there's a dispute, a foreign corporation, for example, doesn't like the fact that Oregon regulates, for example, that Oregon does not allow hard liquor to be sold in supermarkets, the way it is in many other states. California, I think probably maybe over half the states now have, and we have this other system that's a little bit older, but seems to work pretty well. But it cuts into the profits of the transnational liquor companies, right? And so they can now sue us, right? And say your laws are harming our profitability, right? Believe it or not, that's what these ISDS provisions allow. Okay? The investor-state dispute settlement process is built into treaties like NAFTA and the upcoming Trans-Pacific Partnership. It allows foreign investors to sue participating governments if they do anything that harms their investment in that nation. Corporations can sue governments through this process, but governments cannot sue corporations. Okay? So as Todd Tucker pointed out in the Washington Post, a wide range of policies can be challenged under a wide range of public health policies, for example, can be challenged as violations of these investor-state dispute settlement provisions. Okay? Argentina, for example, has had its macroeconomic policies challenged, Australia its anti-smoking efforts, and Costa Rica its environmental preservation laws. Anyway, so now it's been confirmed, which we like to do, and we like to see a peer-reviewed study. Rather than making far-out claims, then you can be easily identified or designated as a conspiracy theorist, and you're just out of your mind. This isn't actually happening. Well, you got to soberly analyze as best you can. Do a scientific, peer-reviewed study, and then maybe you're not just talking. You're not crazy. And rather, what's going on is the world seems to be going increasingly crazy, and property seems to be increasingly subverting the will of democracy and human rights. And of course, ground zero of this process is our land, air, water, wildlife. Right? They're the first ones to go. Our common resources, so it's totally relevant to talk about something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership when we talk about social ecology, right? And it's perfectly relevant to compare the kind of global governance structure that a social ecologist might advocate with the kind of global governance structure that the world seems to be going to now because of the corruption of our governments and the stranglehold that giant corporations have. And they get to write all this stuff, right? And it's all done secretly. It's all done secretly, in secret. And who's the number one cheerleader? Sadly enough, it's just the same old, right? You think one day, you know, Charlie Brown's going to kick the football out and Lucy's not going to pull it away, right? But anyway, Lucy always shows back up again and pulls the football away. You guys don't get that because that's the older generation from Peanuts, right? But anyway, the old comic strip. Anyway, but why do I talk about this? Because this is an example of the consolidation of wealth, and this is an example of an institutional reinforcement of structures of domination that are nakedly economic and just nakedly all about power and money, right? And it seems to be the case that those who have the most money have the most political power. And they seem, through these agreements, they seem to be consolidating their hold over all the resources on the planet, including labor, right? So they drive down the cost of labor, seems to be one of their principal objectives, which is why our jobs have all been outsourced, right? That's one of their goals. Their goal isn't part of their goal, obviously. Their number one goal is just to make their products in a cheaper labor environment where they don't have to pay as much money for labor, right? But the result of that is a downward pressure on labor in this country, and then lo and behold, after 20 or 30 years of downward pressure on wages in this country, then some of those companies come back and they build new factories in our country, and yet by then the jobs that they have available pay a fraction of what they did before because pressure on wages has pushed wages down, right? So why do we talk about this in an environmental ethics class? Because that's the social ecologists argue. It's preposterous and naive and absurd to begin to consider the practical, at a practical level, what's happening to natural resources is impossible to understand without understanding the history of Western neoliberal political and legal and economic arrangements, right? How our society has organized wealth and commerce over the last 300 years, let's say since the Industrial Revolution, right? And although, as we'll see, Murray Bookchin does offer us a fairly sophisticated moral philosophy and axiology, we have to kind of reconstruct it. But at a practical level, social ecologists always come back to their basic point that the environmental crisis is simultaneously a social crisis, and the most important aspects of every ecological crisis around the world are social in nature and are economic in nature, right? And so we cannot anymore afford to pretend that we can address the environmental crises, all kinds of environmental crises around the world without addressing our economic system, right? Somehow revolutionizing our relationship with our societies, our collective relationship with natural resources in a manner perhaps suggested by someone like Christopher Stone, right? Who wants to just change our legal system so that non-human natural entities or ecological wholes in particular have access to our legal system, right? Through this guardianship system. And that, of course, as I always point out, it has a dramatic effect on our economic system too, but it's not a top-down, right? Which would be more perhaps what a socialist would push, right? A socialist would perhaps recognize that these ecological crises are so advanced that we need a large international organization to intervene. And probably we need both. We need all kinds of solutions, right? Because things have gotten so bad, perhaps, we do need to push more for some kind of international governance structure to counteract this commerce-based structure, right? And to reassert the power of the people, right? The power of the people is, lo and behold, almost always on the side of protecting the people's resources, right? Including the people's labor, but certainly the people's land, air, water, and wildlife. And it's just heartbreaking, a lot of the things that are going on, around the world that seem to just be accelerating. But let's get into our lecture notes a little bit. Politically, Murray Bookchin identified, I think it's safe to say that he identified his own views as really an eclectic mix of anarchism, socialism, bioregionalism, and civil libertarianism, certainly. He certainly identifies also there's a rich tradition of civil libertarianism. And his point is that, I mean, one of his economic point, one of the points he makes about our economic system is that our economic system tends to exclude large numbers of people from economic opportunities. And economic opportunities are central to any kind of civil opportunities, right? So your civil liberties, your civil freedoms and rights, from Bookchin's point of view, you cannot be a civil libertarian and defend those things, right? Your ability to do things, right? Hey, let me do this. Let me grow pot in my yard. Let me marry a person of the same sex and gender. Let me have an abortion. Let me have 10,000 semi-automatic rifles in my attic, right? Let me do all these things. I want to do that. I'm not harming anybody, right? That's the civil libertarian claim. Murray Bookchin comes in, like many civil libertarians, and say, look, you got to have economic opportunities. You got to have strong labor unions that defend the rights of laborers on the marketplace, in the labor market, et cetera, right? You need to have economic opportunities in order to be able to exercise your civil opportunities, right? Your civil rights and liberties. And so he offers us kind of a socialist slant, right? So to Bookchin, there's no conflict between the idea of the basic idea of civil libertarianism and the basic idea of socialism. They are both designed to protect the rights of ordinary people, including their economic rights and liberties. Okay? So part of him you can read is coming out of this socialist tradition, which has some fairly strong Marxist elements in it, although he himself would reject the idea that he's a Marxist, because he's identifying structures of domination and power that, in a sense, go deeper and are more comprehensive than our economic institutions. So a Marxist might be more inclined to say, we got to change our economic institutions, and then we're on our way toward recovering our humanity, right? But Bookchin would say, no, well, maybe we might be, but we got a lot of other things to do too, right? Because our economic institutions are only part of the story of power and domination in modern Western societies. So he comes out of this, he also, though, comes out of an anarchism tradition. And anarchy, we should stress, or anarchism is the absence of hierarchy. Okay, let's just think of it that way, and let's not import a whole bunch of gnarly, crunchy granola baggage in with it. And let's just think about it that way. Hierarchy is bad, and what we're striving for as activists, perhaps, at every level, whatever level we're interested in politics and changing the world, what we're striving for is difference, respect for difference without domination, all right? So there's structure, there are differences, but they're not on a hierarchical scale anymore, right? Politically or ethically, evaluatively, okay? So in that sense, he considered, and this guy, Peter Kropotkin is another one of probably his biggest influence. And Peter Kropotkin was a Russian anarchist, late 19th century, early 20th century. Peter. He only has one vowel, though, but that's all right. Anyway, and he's kind of enjoyed a resurgence. There's been a resurgence of interest in Kropotkin's writings, but he was writing mostly, I think, around the turn of the 20th century. And the title of his most famous book that I would urge you to read too is Mutual Aid. And you encounter this term, mutual aid, probably several times in the reading that I asked you to do for today. And that whenever Murray Bookchin uses that term, mutual aid, he is kind of referring, sometimes directly, but always at least indirectly, he's wanting you to think of Kropotkin's work. The idea of mutual aid is that cooperation is so deeply ingrained in human behavior that we have these rich and enduring traditions of mutual aid. And you can cite a whole host of different cultural and historical institutions, many of which have gone by the boards. But labor unions are a good example of that. You know, they've always been around. People have always constructed institutions to help one another, and people have always done that with respect to labor, you know. And people have always done that with, you know, the ladies on the frontier, right? Forming library groups and stuff, you know. All these different things that people have done historically to work together, to protect one another's interests, can be characterized as instances of mutual aid. All right, and of course, tribal society, where the community is the #1 priority of everybody thinks first of the community. That would be an ultimate example, right? A very good example of the kind of what Kropotkin means and what Bookchin means when he talks about mutual aid. But stepping back, you know, social ecology is this huge movement that's been around for a long time. It's hard to say when it started. Marx, you know, certainly, but it's been around forever. I mean, social justice, Jesus was the first social ecologist. Or no, I shouldn't even say that, because he's just expressing a popular sentiment of his time. Not popular, but, you know, a counterculture undercurrent of aspiration for brotherhood and for justice, for fairness, right? In those days, they weren't worried about fairness toward Mother Earth or toward ecological wholes, because nothing that they did affected ecological wholes, you know, very much, right? Because they weren't capable of doing very much because they didn't have a lot of technology. But certainly the message, you know, I mean, the message, if this person described in the New Testament existed and was a real live human being and walked around at some time, his message seems to have been a message of social justice, right? And a message of human rights, a message that all humans have a fundamental dignity, right? No matter who they are, whether they're prostitutes or low, you know, beggars on the street or whatever. They all have human dignity, and they all deserve to be left alone to a certain extent, right? Anyway, so this is a very old tradition, is what I'm saying. And you can't just pin it down and say, well, this all flows out of Murray Bookchin. Not at all, not at all. It's not, and really in a way you can't say that even about deep ecology, because deep ecology kind of springs forth from all these cultural fountains, right? But at least the term and the initial conceptualization of deep ecology came from a philosopher, right? A real bona fide professional academic philosopher. Murray Bookchin cannot be described as an academic philosopher. He held various temporary teaching positions throughout his life, but he never had a tenured, you know, position in any faculty, and he was more of a street level intellectual. All right, and he actually worked as an electrician, I believe, for a lot of his life, and was also a union activist and stuff like that. But social ecology has coalesced into a unified philosophical and political movement for at least the last 40 or 50 years. It's very well developed, is what I'm saying. You know, it draws partly from Marx, who is a Kantian, by the way. Marx is another neo-Kantian. A holistic anthro, right, pretty much is what Marx is. And these social ecologists, I think, are best described as holistic anthropocentric thinkers at a practical level. But Murray Bookchin offers us more than that metaphysically. And metaphysically, he's another pluralist, which is why we study him now. But social ecology offers us a coherent, radical critique of our current social, political, and anti-ecological trends, right? Coherent, radical critique, for example, of what's wrong with the tendency toward globalism dominated by giant transnational energy companies, for example, that disable our global community's capacity to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Social ecology also offers us a reconstructive, ecological, communitarian, and ethical approach to society. Okay, it promotes a directly democratic confederal politics. This term that Murray Bookchin likes is confederated municipalism. And he envisions, you know, the ultimate unit of political power, the basic unit of political power is the municipality, right? And then if a municipality wants to form alliances, confederations with other municipalities, then it obviously can do so. But the political structure is going to grow organically from the municipalities, you know, coming together, not from some you know, God, if there's one place that could use just a total house cleaning, right? You don't want to injure anybody, you don't want to hurt anybody, you don't want houses to fall down or anything like that, but you just kind of wish that something new could just suddenly just sweep over that place, and they shouldn't have all that power. It's ridiculous, and that's what Murray Bookchin is saying. So, for example, Portland might end up forming an alliance with, who would we confederate with? Seattle? All right. And Gresham could confederate with Clackamas, right? Or Salem.
What are you thinking, that much smaller, or are you thinking, how much, what size are we talking?
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to, sure, Murray Bookchin would be all about. He'd hesitate, he'd counsel us to slow down a little bit and consider such a large confederacy. But many radical environmentalists envision Cascadia, right? The state of Cascadia, which would include Seattle and Portland. All right. So beyond, as a body of ideas, social ecology envisions a moral economy that moves beyond scarcity and hierarchy toward a world that reharmonizes human communities with the natural world while celebrating diversity, creativity, and freedom. Okay? Social ecology aims to replace our mentality of domination with an ethics of complementarity. Such ethics reflect our true role, which is to learn to accommodate a fuller, richer world for all beings. The result should be a society based on ecological principles, an organic unity in diversity, free of hierarchy and based on mutual respect for the interrelationship of all aspects of life. So difference without domination, difference without hierarchy, okay? That difference is an important part of it too, because we don't want to just level everything off, right? Everything manifests and flowers and blossoms in its own way. So, and that's good. We want to encourage that, and that's the process of nature too, encourages. There is a teleological, for those of you who are curious and haven't done the reading yet. If you've done the reading, then you're already sniffing around, and this dude's kind of throwing out some teleological language here, and he seems to be making these broad sweeping claims about some teleological features of evolutionary history. And this is kind of starting to remind me a little bit of Holmes-Ralston, right? Which it should, because he's reading into evolutionary history, something that many evolutionary historians have identified, but haven't identified as a telos, right? But it does appear to be the case that evolutionary history is inclined toward the production of increasing biodiversity. And as the species that nature produces, generates, but see there, I'm right? Talking that way, I'm attributing some metaphysical status to nature, right? But it does appear to be the case that as evolutionary history proceeds, the kinds of animals it produces are increasingly more mobile, more individuated,